Outburst, a Todd Mills Mystery, Book 4. Author, R.D. Zimmerman. Publisher, Scribble Pub, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1998. Narrator, Eric Aust. Chapter 5. "I'm not crazy," said Todd. "I saw someone get shot. The day after the storm, the day after Mark Forrest, if indeed that was his real name, had vanished." Todd stood on the stone arch bridge, staring through the haze at the roaring falls of St. Anthony. The mighty Mississippi was all the mightier from last night's torrential rains, and a continuous wall of water burst over the concrete apron, rushed and swirled its way toward the inevitable gulf. Todd felt a hand on his back, and then heard Steve Rollins say, "I'm sure you did," nodding to the sheriff's boats anchored down below and the handful of divers. Rollins added, "And I'm sure they'll find the body soon." The air was close and hot. A slight rain was falling, and Todd pulled up the collar of his shirt. "This just doesn't make any sense." Last night, Rollins had taken charge because, of course, he and his partner, Neil Forster, were in car 1110, meaning that as the homicide investigators on duty, the case was automatically theirs. The trouble was that at first there'd been no indication of any crime. No gun, no bullet casing, not to mention any sign of a body. Thanks to the heavy rains, there hadn't even been any visible traces of blood. Insisting, however, that this be thoroughly handled, Rollins had called Car 21, the Bureau of Investigation team, and the guys on duty in that division had gotten out their pump bottle of luminol and sprayed the chemical on part of the bridge. As the summer light had faded, they'd then shone a black light on the spot, and certain proteins had fluoresced, indicating blood and plenty of it. A full investigation had been immediately set in motion, and now a bunch of divers were down there bobbing for a body. "I was standing right here," began Todd, hanging onto the railing, "wondering if anyone would show." "Okay." Rollins was a rugged kind of guy who was nevertheless naturally patient, thorough. "Go on, just take it slow." "And then someone came up behind and touched me. It was him, this guy, this Mark Forrest. The mysterious Mr. X. We're still searching, but no one by that name has been reported as missing. Well, this guy, whatever his name was no bum. I got the sense that he was gay, but I could be wrong. Anyway, he was gorgeous, and someone's going to want him back. Someone's going to come looking for him. You can trust me on that one." "He said he was here because you called him." "Right. And I was here because I got a call from someone. A guy who said something about blackmail." Todd shook his head. "So, obviously, there was some sort of setup going on." "I guess so." Rollins scratched his neck and asked, "Do you think the whole shooting could have been staged somehow?" "What do you mean?" "You know, fake bullet, an old bag of blood, a scam of sorts for a television reporter?" "Maybe, but why? I can't think how it would connect to any of the stories I'm working on. Not even the one about the drug dealers in the suburbs." Recalling the look on Mark Forrest's face, he added, "I haven't seen that many people shot, but it sure as hell looked real to me, and Forrest certainly didn't look like some kind of shyster. If anything, he seemed very genuine." For the third or fourth time, they walked through exactly what had happened, and where Todd was sure of the exact spot he'd been standing when Forrest had approached him. He was able to recall what they'd done as soon as the rain had started pelting down. He remembered, too, when he'd first seen the approaching figure. "Then the wind hit," said Todd. "It just came roaring down the river with nothing to block it. I thought it was a tornado." But it hadn't been. There hadn't been any great vortex, no massive twirling wind sucking everything upward. Rather, it had been the nearly as destructive straight-line winds, which were brought by derechos, a phenomenon of squall line, thunderstorms, that sent blasts of cold air hurling downward in a straight, broad, destructive swath. And yesterday's sheer wall of force had bowled over the plains at, according to weather experts, which every other person in Minnesota considered himself to be, nearly 100 miles per hour, and dumped over 2 inches of rain in 10 minutes. So the last time he saw Mark Forrest, Rollins said, as he moved to the railing on the other side of the bridge, he was standing here, clutching the bullet wound. Todd ran over the sequence in his mind. Then that sign hit me and I blacked out for a few minutes. So, as best they could figure, one of 3 things had taken place. Mark Forrest had been blown into the river. The person who shot him had dragged away his body, or it had been a total ruse and no one had been killed. Todd crossed the metal railing, which was tall, nearly chest high, and said, "But I don't get how anyone could have been blown over this. I mean, maybe if that had been a tornado, he could have been sucked up and dumped into the river, but the wind just came hard from one side, so if anything, it would have just pinned him against the railing, not thrown him up and over, and the guy with the gun wasn't very big. I'm sure of that, so if he dragged Forrest away, there would have been bloodstains or drag marks or something." Yeah, the B of I guys did a pretty good job of going over the entire bridge, said Rollins, for they had combed everything, including the parking areas on either side of the river. Here's another possibility. The assailant dumped the body over the railing while you were blacked out. Perhaps, peering down at the small fleet of boats and the turgid water, Todd considered that possibility, thinking how it was the one scenario that made the most sense. But if that were really the case, if Forrest had been heaved into the Mississippi, where was the body, and when would this vast river give it up? The current was swift here, with swirls of root beer-like foam curling and turning, and Todd gazed from one bank to the other. On his right, the ruins of the gold metal flour mill towered in the haze like an abandoned castle. On the left stood an amalgamation of dark brick buildings, while straight ahead, maybe a half-mile downstream, the murky waters churned over another dam and through another lock. If the body of Mark Forrest were really in the Mississippi, would the divers be able to find it, or had it disappeared permanently into the mucky bottom? Todd stared down at one of the columns of the bridge and said, "If he'd been tossed over, it would have been somewhere around here. Maybe he would have struck the side of the bridge, but I don't see any blood." "Neither do I," seconded Rollins, who stared through the haze at a small group of cops combing the far bank. "We should probably check out the next lock, see if there's anything hung up down there." "That's a pretty thought." Rollins walked down the bridge about 50 feet to the spot where his partner, Neil Forrest, stood leaning on the railings and watching the sheriff's divers far below. Nearing 60 bald and paunchy, Foster had been in the force forever, and was one of the more respected investigators around. 3 years ago, when his partner had retired, he'd brought Rollins from the juvenile division into homicide. When they'd been working on a bridge case, a juvenile homicide, Rollins now spoke briefly with him. Foster shrugged, and Rollins headed back to Todd. "Foster's going to stick it out here," said Rollins. "Come on." As the rain misted them, they walked briskly toward the downtown bank of the river. "Thanks for taking this so seriously," said Todd gently, squeezing Rollins on the arm. "Thank God you weren't hurt." No shit. Do you think the police would have been so thorough about this if you weren't involved? I sure as hell hope so. After all, the luminol did show blood, and a lot of it too, said Rollins. But don't forget, they know you. You're Mr. TV. Actually, one of the guys wondered if this wasn't a drill, a test to see if they were really doing their job. You mean they were worried it was part of some expose or something? Exactly. Todd shook his head, said, Everyone's jaded, aren't they? Rollins shrugged. Especially me. Enough of that. Oh, that's right. I'm supposed to be happy and hopeful. Just positive, said Todd, instantly regretting his choice of words. With a dark laugh, Rollins looked over his shoulder to make sure no one could overhear. On the force and everywhere else, he was out about his sexuality, but most definitely not about his health. Then said, That's the one thing I wish I could forget. Back in the parking lot, they left Rollins' Taurus and proceeded in Todd's dark green Grand Cherokee. This next stretch of the Great River Road, a riverside parkway with a road bike path and pedestrian path, had yet to be completed, and so he turned just past the renovated mill that housed the Whitney Hotel, heading by another mill, a now desolate building where sluices had once powered looms that had woven blankets by the thousands. He came to Washington Avenue and turned left. Neither one of them had ever been down to the next lock, and damn, so neither one of them knew how to get down there. With the windshield wipers swiping slowly back and forth and the air conditioning on high just to thin the thick air, Todd took one turn which ended in a dead end. Struggling to see through the slow rain, Rollins suggested another road which led past a liquor store and ended at some railroad tracks. In the end, Todd decided to drive to the west bank of the University of Minnesota. The parkway starts again down there, he said. I think we can park down on the flats and walk up toward the next lock. Great. That'll give us a good look at the river, too. Where once had stood a shantytown inhabited by dirt-poor Scandinavian immigrants, where later had been piled on an enormous mountain of coal used by the U, now stretched a new portion of the river parkway. Todd drove down a steep road that led to the river, turned left, and entered one end of a long public lot that had recently been constructed. He drove toward the end, parked, and he and Rollins got out and plugged the meter with a couple of quarters. The rain fell in an annoying tempo, between a mist and a light drizzle. Not something that called for an umbrella, but enough to dampen everything. Todd glanced across the river, which was none too wide at this point, and looked up the tall, ragged limestone cliff at the university buildings on the east bank. This definitely felt like an old river, one that had been cutting itself deeper and deeper into the earth for thousands of years, and this area definitely felt like a lost part of the city, something hidden away like a scruffy, shameful child. The city, in its own sluggish way, was trying to reclaim the Mississippi, turn it from a workhorse of water power and barge traffic into a recreational treasure. When the parkway was completed, when the road and paths were extended upriver another mile or two to the Stone Arch Bridge, that just might happen too. In the meantime, though, this was an obscure place, unknown to most, used by an anonymous few. Todd heard a car, looked over his shoulder, and saw a rusty white Honda Civic station wagon pulling into a far corner. So what was their story? That man and woman in the front seat, what were they doing down here on such a dreary day? The parkway simply stopped, a band of pavement that ended and immediately turned into a dirt. Random young trees sprouted every which way, and Todd and Rollins cut through them and made their way to a hidden beach. Todd pushed aside some branches, came upon some sand, and walked right up the quickly moving water. You know, he said, staring at the water, we drink the water from this river every day, but I don't think I've ever been this close to the river itself. I don't think I've ever been to a place where I could just stick my foot in it. He looked straight up, saw an abandoned steel train trestle towering away overhead and covered with graffiti. Many jumpers? Rollins shrugged. A couple or three every year, usually in winter when they're guaranteed a quick death. Some guy jumped off this one. What was it? Last March. Smashed right through some ice floes. How long did it take to find his body? Almost 2 weeks. Where? Downtown St. Paul. Got hung up on one of the houseboats. So it could take that long or longer, suggested Todd, for Mark Forrest's body to turn up? If in fact it does surface. Right, thought Todd, because certainly not everything that tumbled into the Mississippi actually rose to the top. Mark Forrest's body, after all, could be pinned anywhere. Down there, including against the base of the lock and dam, where it could remain. Well, until there were no remains. They continued up a dirt path and into some heavier growth. The river bent, and up ahead Todd could make out the 10th Avenue Bridge, as well as that of Interstate 35 West. If there was no body, if no one had been killed, Todd tried to conjure what this might be all about. The biggest story he was working on, of course, was about the suburban drug scene. After repeated attempts, he'd finally gotten a couple of dealers to talk to him. As long as their faces were concealed, they agreed to have the conversation taped. "Shit, man," said one dealer, who'd recently moved up from Gary. "These people up here are shit crazy for drugs. I'm selling 10 times more than I was back home." "Fuck the inner city," said another, seated in the front seat of a Channel 10 van, his face concealed by the headrest, as he was taped from behind. "Those folk can't afford squat. The only business worth doing is in the suburbs, because that's where the white folk with money live. That's why I set up shop out there. You gotta go where the money is, man, and that's the suburbs." But how, Todd now wondered, could a fake death tie into that? Was someone trying to frame Todd for a murder? But why? The paranoid side of Todd, which for so long had worked at concealing his sexuality, searched from some scheme, but could find none. Or could this be one of Channel 7's elaborate schemes? No, even they, his former employers, weren't that warped. Rollins veered to the left. Todd glanced after him, and a part of Todd wanted both of them to chuck all this. His career in television? Rollins is a homicide investigator on the Minneapolis police force. All their friends, everything they had here. Instead, he envisioned the two of them escaping, running off to France and biking through Provence, pushing on and on so that nothing could catch up with them, hiding out in sunny Mexico where no one could find them. Dear God, thought Todd, staring after the perfectly handsome and healthy man. What will I do if I lose him? So was it here, the miracle everyone had been waiting for? Was there really a chance of saving Steve Rollins from AIDS? Slipping into a downward spiral of fear. If he gets sick, will I know what to do? Will I be strong enough? Todd followed a narrow trail onto a low ridge. He gazed up through the mist at the freeway bridge. In the distance, he glanced over at the swift waters of the river. Along the bank, he saw some pop cans, a tire, and some material lurking and waving just beneath the surface. He recognized it, really, before he knew what it was. He'd seen that plaid, of course, seen it quite recently. Rollins! He cut swiftly through the undergrowth, and the closer he came, the more he saw. Jeans, a brown leather shoe, one bloated, semi-floating hand, Todd rushed down to the river's edge and stared at the half-submerged figure. "What?" called Rollins, cutting through the shrub. "It's him!" The corpse of Mark Forrest was caught up on the tire, one leg poking through the center, the rest of his body tugged downstream by the current. He was face down in not quite a foot of water, but Todd knew it was him, the same guy he'd met on the bridge. Rollins, of course, stepped into his training as quickly and automatically as if he were putting on an old shoe. He moved right to the water's edge, took a mental note of the scene. "Do you have your cell phone?" asked Rollins. "It's in the car." "Go call 911. Ready to tear back to his car, Todd took a half step, then stopped. Rollins was stepping into the water. The possibilities flashed through Todd's head, and he wanted to scream, "Don't! That water's filthy. You might have a cut on your foot. You might get an infection." But nagging, as Todd had learned the hard way, had done zip for their relationship. So he forced himself to turn and dash through the brush, right as Rollins had said. More than once, if HIV didn't kill him, then the worry was going to kill Todd. Trying not to imagine the world as one gigantic infection, Todd reached the dirt path seconds later, and then finally the pavement and the end of the parkway. As fast as he could, he tore into the parking lot and up to his truck, where he dialed 911 and reported what Sergeant Steve Rollins and he had found and where. He hung up and was about to take off when he dialed his second number. Rollins probably wouldn't like this, but after all, Todd had a job to do as well. "Good morning, Channel 10. How may I direct your call?" "Hi, this is Todd Mills. Who's this?" he said, never able to remember the receptionist's names. "Renee." "Right. Listen, Renee, would you get me the assignment desk right away? It's an emergency." "Of course." When the editor on duty picked up, Todd relayed the situation and demanded that a photographer be rushed to the scene even more quickly. Todd hung up, then slammed shut his car door and charged out of the parking lot. As he did so, he glanced over at the small Honda station wagon and through a veil of steam on the car windows saw a half-naked ass rising up and down, up and down. It flashed through Todd's mind. Boy, the sirens are going to scare the shit out of them. By the time Todd had run back down the path over the ridge and to the spot Rollins was standing knee-deep in the water, he wore a thin pair of latex gloves, and while he hadn't moved or flipped the body, he had retrieved a black nylon wallet, which he was now thumbing through. Todd stared at the body, saw the blue plaid shirt and the head, which looked severely mangled. Todd asked, "What happened to him? Was he shot in the head too?" "I don't think so. It looks like he didn't in fact get caught up in the lock. His face is almost ripped off." Rollins studied a plastic credit card. "But it's him. It's Mark Forrest. His driver's license says he lives at 4895 Young Avenue South." He came to another piece of ID, stared at it, and gasped, "Jesus Christ!" "What? What is it?" "He's a cop. A cop with the Minneapolis Park Police." A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.